In this video, we are going to talk about William Blake, who was an artist who was inspired by Swedenborg. William Blake read quite a few of Swedenborg's publications, and he went to several of the New Church of Jerusalem's meetings. However, he ultimately rejected Swedenborg's philosophies. He saw them as too one-dimensional and as just furthering the church's dogma. Blake was an English poet and artist who was born in 1757 in London. Blake claimed to have visions, just like Swedenborg did. Remember how Swedenborg was talking to angels and evil spirits and spirits in general from all different planets? Well, Blake was also a seer. He saw otherworldly beings and corresponded with them. And he did this for his entire life. His first vision was at the age of 10, where he saw a tree full of angels. I am showing you over here a painting called Ghost of a Flea. This was one of the spirits that he encountered and illustrated. In fact, many of his illustrations and artworks are something he saw in his head, a vision in fact. Now, Ghost of a Flea is when Blake had a spiritual vision not of a flea, but of a ghost of a flea. So it's the spirit of a flea that he's illustrating. And he had this vision and he started to record what he was seeing. He started to draw this vision. And while he was drawing this spirit, the ghost of the flea told him that all fleas were inhabited by the souls of men who were by nature bloodthirsty to excess. And you can see in the painting the ghost of the flea, which is like demonic and monstrous, is looking at a cup of blood. And he's supposed to be looking at it in this kind of bloodthirsty, greedy way. So it's the idea that if you embrace your animal nature, if you embrace greed, bloodthirstiness, excess, that you will kind of de-evolve. You're on the same level as a parasite. Now, if you remember, Swedenborg had the idea of spiritual evolution, right? He thought for those who wanted to spiritually regenerate, that they would open themselves up more to God, let Christ into them, and they would do good works because they desired to do good, and they were spiritually evolving towards God. But there's also this idea, when we look at the ghost of the flea, of de-evolution or evolving towards hell. And this is for those who ultimately reject God, who ultimately let their animal nature take over. They become less human and more like animals. They become parasites. So if you remember, Swedenborg also said that you love what you become, right? Your desire takes you towards action. So if you desire good things, you start to do them. And by doing them, you become good. And in this way, we can see that the desire for, bloodthirst. I'm not sure exactly what he means by bloodthirst. If he means murder or if he just means greed in general. But the idea that there's this excess of greed that leads men to kind of become parasitic is what Blake was referencing here. As a young man, Blake went to art school and apprenticed as an engraver. He had a predilection for Renaissance artists and Greek and Roman classical antiques. So he loved looking at works by Michelangelo, Raphael, and classical Greek and Roman sculpture. We can see this when we look at his figures in his paintings. For example, this is one of Blake's colored prints showing Isaac Newton, the science giant, right? We can see in this image that Blake portrayed the nude human body with classical antique proportions. So the classical Greek and Roman sculptors were very concerned with how to portray an idealized human body. They were often concerned with the ratios or proportions of the parts in connection to the whole. What is the ratio of the head to the whole length of the body? How long should an arm be in relation to the torso? And so on and so forth. And we can see this kind of emphasis in Blake's depictions of the nude when he has this kind of idealized anatomy and these idealized proportions. They very much look like Greek and Roman classical sculpture, especially in the way that he treats the profile of Isaac Newton. You can see that kind of classic Greek profile. Here we are seeing Isaac Newton holding the tools of geometry. So he is the geometer, and he's drawing out a triangle and a circle. Geometry was often thought of as the divine math. So if you remember, when Swedenborg was trying to find something that connected the physical to the spiritual in his work Principia, he thought that what connected the physical to the spiritual would be a precise mathematical point. And from that point, it would expand into various geometric complexities. Remember, we talked about how this sounded similar to the Big Bang. So geometry for Swedenborg, for many Renaissance artists, and for Blake stood in for a deeper reality. Geometry was the hidden structure of the universe. This idea is also similar to Plato's idea of forms. Plato believed that there was an ideal form or an ideal version of everything that exists in the spiritual realm. So there's an ideal archetype of a chair up in the spiritual realm, right? And all the chairs on earth, including this one, would just be an imperfect copy of that ideal archetype. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it sounds a lot like Swedenborg's correspondences theory. Geometry also represented the idea of order, that there was order in this universe, and that God was the divine geometer. God is the original person who orders the entire universe around his set natural laws. And so Newton in this picture is being shown as the scientist who can understand the harmony and the order of the universe that God has set into motion. He can understand God's laws. We also have to remember that Swedenborg believed there was a divine order to the universe. If you remember, God was the central or spiritual sun, the perfect form of love, and from that there was the heavenly or angelic realm, and underneath that there was the spiritual realm full of good and evil spirits, and underneath that there was the physical realm. So different levels of structure in the universe, and the universe was divinely ordered by God. During his lifetime, Blake was an established engraver for book companies and publishers, but he also did paintings and illustrations for classical works like the Bible, Dante's Inferno, Shakespeare, and Milton. He published his own collections of poems with illustrations during his lifetime, but they were not very well received, and he lived in poverty for most of his life. He was known as an eccentric man more than he was known as a poet. To the right of me, you can see an illustration that Blake did for one of Milton's works. The illustration is called The Sun at the Eastern Gate. And in this illustration, we can see a classical nude figure. The classical nude figure is portrayed just like an antique Greek sculpture, right? It's got the contrapposto pose, one leg's forward, one leg's back, one leg is bent, one leg is straight. This is very much classical Greek sculpture that Blake is pulling from. Blake's emphasis on the human form was underpinned by the belief in the divinity of the human figure. This is a belief that he shared with Swedenborg. In fact, it's one of the things that he actually agreed with Swedenborg on. For Swedenborg, the human figure is a reflection of God. Mankind is created in the image and likeness of God. So God himself has the human form. Swedenborg calls God the essential person. When you think of God, Swedenborg says, you think of a person. You think of a divine form, right? But it has the human likeness to it. You don't think of a spirit. You don't think of like a ball of smoke when you think of God. You don't think of maybe an invisible abstraction or something that's just floating like a cloud. Of course, these are representations of God sometimes, but Swedenborg says to think of God merely as some sort of abstract invisible cloud is an incorrect perception of who God actually is. God is Christ, and Christ has the human figure. So Swedenborg says that all angels were once humans that have evolved, and all angels have a perfect human form, whereas all demons have an imperfect human form. And I think we saw what pretty much looked like a demon in that painting by Blake, The Ghost of a Flea. Human form is not just a product of evolution to Swedenborg. So it's not, the human form is not something that was just made through a process of natural selection. Of course, Darwin's theory of evolution hadn't come out yet. That was published in 1859, so we're a few decades before that. The human figure is actually a ubiquitous archetype throughout the entire universe. That is the pinnacle of creation. So God is represented by the human archetypal figure, and because God has the human proportions, has the human figure, all of his creation, the pinnacle of his creation, mankind, also embodies that archetypal structure. Because mankind, I'm going to say it again, mankind is created in the image and likeness of God, according to Swedenborg. Swedenborg also claims that you don't become a soul after death. And what he means by that is that you don't turn into some sort of formless spirit after you die. He says that you shed your material body, your material flesh dies, but that you have a spiritual body in the afterlife that seems just as real to you as your material body did in the physical world. And you're doing all the things that you could do in the physical world with your physical body, in the spiritual world with your spiritual body. In fact, Swedenborg had this idea that the spiritual world was very similar to the physical world. Blake agreed with Swedenborg in terms of the divinity of the human figure. One of Blake's quotes is, "But God is a man, not because he is so perceived by man, but because he is the creator of man." So Blake is saying we're not projecting onto God our human form. We're not saying, oh, the gods are like us because we're this. We're saying we're this way because God is that way. Also, Blake says, all deities reside in the human breast. All deities reside in the human breast. I'm going to touch on that later because I do think that Blake's idea of the divine human was a bit different than Swedenborg's in a certain way, but we'll touch on that later. In Blake's poem, The Divine Image, we can see Blake's belief in the divinity of the human form. I'm going to read just a few stanzas from the poem, although the poem is not long. For mercy, pity, peace, and love is God, our Father dear, and mercy, pity, peace, and love is man, his child in care. So he's relating these virtues, mercy, pity, peace, and love, with both God and man. And then he begins to anthropomorphize the virtues with the human form. So he says, for mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Lastly, in the last stanza he says, and all must love the human form. In heathen, Turk, or Jew, Where mercy, love, and pity dwell, there God is dwelling too. So really what he's saying in the last stanza is that it doesn't matter what race or ethnicity you are. We are all part of the human race. And because of that, God is dwelling in us. Our relation to God is based on the fact that we are human and he has the human form too. Our relation to God is in the amount that we have these virtues: mercy, pity, peace, and love. To the right of me, you can see another print by Blake called The Ancient of Days. This is a very popular print, so you may recognize it. The Ancient of Days is another name for God. It's God as the embodiment of reason. And what do we see him holding? But the calipers of geometry. Just like Isaac Newton was portrayed with the tools of geometry, God is portrayed as the divine orderer or the divine geometer, ordering and shaping the world. Both Swedenborg and Blake believed that Jesus Christ was the divine human. He was the personification of God. He was both completely divine and completely human. So whereas you and I are considered imperfect humans or the reflection of God, Swedenborg and Blake believe that Jesus was truly 100% perfect, 100% divine, and also 100% human at the same time. I think this image by Blake, called Jacob's Ladder, is a perfect image for showing the idea of correspondences, or the idea of a divine ordering. We can see here a ladder that spirals up to heaven. And on that spiral ladder, there are different levels that correspond to each other. We can see the idea of spiritual evolution, or becoming more divine ourselves as we become closer to God. And we also get the sense that there is a divine order, hierarchy, and structure to heaven and earth. Swedenborg actually had this concept of the universal human. And Blake also believed in this idea. For Swedenborg, heaven was a universal human. So all the spirits, all the angels, all the humans in heaven formed together a human form in heaven. It's like the idea of a grand man or a grand human in heaven. The different communities of angels and humans in heaven formed the different organs of this grand human. Each community of angels had a different function or a different purpose. Remember how we talked about angels who assimilated knowledge or distributed knowledge? They would probably correspond to the brain or the nervous system or the mouth, right? In this universal man. So each angel community, depending on their function that they fulfilled, corresponded to a different part of this universal human. If the angels were perhaps making things, if they were creating stuff, they might correspond to the hands of the universe, the hands of the universal man. And a funny anecdote to illustrate more about the universal man, Swedenborg talks about those who during their lifetimes were very evil, but who are accepted into heaven because they repent. When they are accepted into heaven, they are given the choice to shed their evil beliefs, their evil desires. However, if they find it hard to release or let go of these desires or beliefs, they are taken to the intestines of heaven. Now we know that the intestines are a place in our bodies where the nutritious versus the toxic are separated. So your body separates and then absorbs the nutritious nutrients and disregards or gets rid of the toxic waste products. So it's a place of separation. And the community of angels that represents the intestines and the universal human helps those who are evil shed or get rid of or release the toxic parts of themselves. What is quite funny is that Swedenborg says that those who are evil, who have repented, if they find that they can't shed these evil desires, they're basically expelled out of the rectum of the universal human. So Swedenborg is saying that those who can't shed their evil ways are pooped out of the universal human, which I find quite amusing. I would not want to be one of the angels who was in the community of the rectum of the universal human. But moving forward, Blake also believed in this idea of all of us collectively making up one grand universal human. And when I'm saying universal human, think of it on a huge scale. Think of every single angel and spirit and human in this universal human. We are the cells of this universal human. So just as the cells of our body are tiny and there are trillions of them and they make us up, so each human and angel and spirit together, we make up this kind of grand cosmological man. To illustrate that Blake believed a similar theory, he says, we live as one man. He's talking about us collectively. We collectively live as one man. For contracting our infinite senses, we behold multitude. So Blake says, when we perceive on a finite scale, we see all the differences. We see us all separately. Or expanding, if we expand our infinite senses, we behold as one. As one man, all the universal family. And that one man we call Jesus Christ. And he and us, and we and him, live in perfect harmony in Eden, the land of life, giving, receiving, and forgiving each other's trespasses. So Blake is saying that collectively, we make up Jesus Christ. Collectively, the family of God makes up Christ. And what he's really saying is that when we contract our senses, or when we pull away from the spiritual and just focus on the physical, we can't really see how we're all connected, how we're all one, right? He says we see multitude. So we see many separate things, a multitude of many different things. But it's when we expand our senses that we start to see how everything is connected and how we are all one and how we are all working together and how we all actually create the divine, how we are all part and partake in Christ. He says Christ is in us and we are part of Christ. In this quote by Blake, we can see his opinion about the human relationship to the divine. He says, we are all coexistent with God, members of the divine body. We are all partakers of the divine nature. When Blake was asked about the divinity of Jesus Christ, Blake said, he is the only God. But then he also added, and so am I, and so are you. In this respect, Blake does differ from Swedenborg a little bit. He takes it a step further than Swedenborg. Whereas Swedenborg says that we are all reflections of God, we aren't God himself. We are part of God, but individually, we aren't God. That's what Swedenborg says. However, I tend to think that Blake took it a bit further than Swedenborg. I'm not sure to what extent he meant that man is Christ, but he does tend to glorify and exalt humans to such a degree that there seems to be a bit more of this individual divinity than Swedenborg really was comfortable with. Because you have to remember, Swedenborg said that everything good that we do is actually God doing good through us. So he believed, remember, we are just vessels, God is acting through us, however much light and love we open ourselves to is how divine we are. Whereas Blake has this idea that the individual is equal to Christ by being in Christ. And I don't really see that thought evident in Swedenborg. However, Blake did agree with Swedenborg's belief that heaven is inside of you, not outside of you. Remember how Swedenborg said that heaven is an internal state of peace, of joy, of love on this earth? Well, Blake says, in your own bosom you bear heaven. So bosom, just another word for chest or breast. And earth and all you behold. Though it appears without, though heaven appears externally, it is within. So though heaven appears without, it is actually within. In your imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow. So you have to remember that Blake was a poet and an artist first, and the idea of imagination was very important to him. And he sees the creative imagination as the real reality from which you create physical manifestations, which are just shadows of your thought, shadows of your imagination. So he's really equating the imagination with a kind of spiritual realm, a kind of creative spiritual realm from which other things are birthed. Just like Swedenborg believed that everything that was physical came out of a spiritual dimension or a spiritual realm. Because Swedenborg believed that heaven was something that's inside of you, his followers believed that heaven could be built on earth. That's why they called themselves the Church of the New Jerusalem, re-establishing the holy place here on earth was their mission. And the idea that Swedenborg really believed that you should put yourself into useful service of others gave many of Swedenborg followers the idea of activism in this lifetime, the idea of serving others, of righting wrongs, of establishing peace and prosperity in this earth, in this lifetime. So Blake also had similar ideals for England. He expresses it in one of his poems, actually called Jerusalem. He talks about how Christ walked among the hills of England in ancient times, but now the hills of England are filled with dark, satanic mills. So what is he referring to here? These satanic mills are a reference to the early industrial revolution that's taking place in England, the factories that are springing up and replacing small businesses with huge factories that have a division of labor. The Albion Flour Mill was one of the first factories established in London. It was a major factory, a rotary steam-powered flour mill that could produce 6,000 bushels of flour per week. It basically would have driven independent traditional flour millers out of business. And there was a large pushback from workers who would have lost their entire livelihood, their entire small business to this huge factory. And so even though this flour mill was built, a few short years later, it was destroyed in 1791 by a fire, perhaps deliberately. In Blake's poem Jerusalem, he says, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green?" So here he's talking about Christ inhabiting the land of England. "And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills?" Then he has a call for action. "Bring me my bow of burning gold. Bring me my arrows of desire. Bring me my spear, O clouds unfold. Bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land." So once again we see a call to action, a call to establishing Jerusalem, or this idea of heaven on earth in England, a call to get rid of these dark satanic mills that are taking over the English pastoral land. For Blake, the factories in England that were springing up were lifeless. They were dead. They were inhuman. Blake rejected this machine-oriented way of living. He rejected the mechanical model of the universe. It was just beginning, this idea of science being preeminent over religion. But Blake didn't see the universe as some big clock with spinning cogs and wheels, devoid of a creator. To Blake, this idea of a mechanistic model of the universe was really indicative of too much of the reasoning faculty. We know that Blake thought there was divine order and divine reason to the universe, but reason without imagination stripped the universe of its humanity. When we look at Swedenborg, we see dualities. We see traditional dualities like good and evil, heaven versus hell, Christ versus Satan. But when we look at Blake, there was the duality of imagination versus reason. He wasn't totally against reason, but he was against reason without imagination. Blake saw Christ as the imagination of God. So think about that for a second. Christ is imagination. What does that mean? Christian virtues like love and forgiveness are achieved through the imaginative act of identifying with another individual. Empathy, right? Christ as the imagination allows us to expand our view and see how we are all connected. And it allows us to empathize with other individuals because we can put ourselves in their place. Imagination was the faculty of achieving empathy and harmony with another human being. Through imagination, we see other perspectives, we realize the divine and the Christ in others. You can think of it this way. Creativity and imagination connects, whereas reason and rules divide. Blake also saw Christ as a rebel. Blake was very much against the dogma of the church. He saw the church as imposing religious codes that had nothing to do with God. And Christ was the breaker of those codes. So Christ came to tear down the legalistic laws that don't allow for natural human behavior. This is where Blake begins to separate from Swedenborg. Swedenborg believes that we are all sinners, that we're trying to evolve and shed our old ways. Blake believes that our inner natures should not be squashed. He believes that these laws, these rules that either the church or the government imposes, is actually repressing our real human inner nature, our natural desires. He really believed that sex was a natural human desire and that there shouldn't be so many strict moral codes around it. In his response to Swedenborg's book, Heaven and Hell, Blake wrote The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he says, "Now hear a plain fact. Swedenborg has not written one new truth. Now hear another. He has written all the old falsehoods." Basically what he's saying is that Swedenborg just created a new dogma, a new set of rules for everyone to follow. So he's no better than the church. In The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, Blake shows Jesus breaking all the rules that Moses put forward in the Old Testament. Jesus can do this because he's acting from impulse. To Blake, this idea of acting from impulse or acting from your intuition, your gut instinct, is what's honorable. It's what makes you truly human. Rules and dogma that are superimposed from the outside, from the church, from the government, from strict social mores, go against our very nature, go against our divine nature that we just intuitively know. Basically, it's the idea that you know what's best for you and you don't need an outside authority to tell you that. Blake starts to part ways with Swedenborg because to Blake there wasn't as clear of a definition between good and evil. Good and evil made up the whole of the human experience. And having that human experience, having those misadventures, those crooked paths, was important to Blake. In fact, in Blake's Proverbs of Hell, he makes this very clear when he says, "You never know what is enough unless you know what is more than enough." He also says, "Exuberance is beauty." Lastly, he says, "Improvement makes straight roads, but the crooked roads without improvement are roads of genius." So what Blake is saying is that to take the straight and narrow road that is laid before us by others, by the church, by the dogma of the church, is to not really experience life and what life is about. You may want to improve yourself and take the straight and narrow path, but you're missing the crooked roads. And what life is about is making these mistakes, making these crooked roads. To Blake, they're not mistakes. They're part of the experience of human life. They're part of the human experience, which is not perfect, which is not easy or logical. Everything just doesn't unfold step by step in your life with a perfect plan, right? You probably realize this. But true genius comes out of following the path of intuition. The path that you follow because you know it's the right one for you. The path where you explore life instead of telling life the way it should be. The path where you release control of how you think life should be and follow the crooked road. It's the road for those who truly want to experience life. For Blake, less is not more. More is more, and he delights in doing more. He delights in passions and desires. He wants to know, how far can you take it? In the Proverbs of Hell, he also condemns the different legalistic codes that trap us. For example, he says, "Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion." So he was quite the reformer of his day. Brothels are built with the bricks of religion. Yeah, he's really throwing it at the church. He also says, "The fox condemns the trap, not himself." So what he's saying there is that these rules and these laws of the church and of the government aren't fair. It's not fair that you're caught in this trap. It's the whole system that's unfair. It catches you in a trap. You're not the problem. The system, the laws that are unfair are the problem. In this illustration that Blake did for a collection of his poems, we can see his attitude towards duality. At the bottom of the image, it says, "Showing the two contrary states of the human soul." While Swedenborg said, "Life is what you love, and you love what you become," with the subcontext that you should desire after the good, Blake was more about desire itself. It's more important to have the experience than to only search for good. It's more important to explore the limits and the boundaries of human experience than it is to confine yourself to rules, regulations, or, as he saw them, to traps. In Songs of Innocence and Experience, he's showing the two different states of the human soul. Not so that you could reject the one, but so that you can move those two states into a whole. So that you can accept the parts of yourself that you don't necessarily like. So that you can accept the mistakes you've made. So that you can accept the desires that you'd rather repress. He's saying, no, that's part of what makes you divine. And he's trying to bring these two opposites, these two different polarities of innocence, experience, back into balance, back into a whole. We will see this idea of bringing duality into unity so many times through different mystics in this course. It's just pervasive in all the Hermetic literature. Blake is really saying, don't deny your shadow self, the side of yourself that you'd really rather not look at. It's part of you too, and you basically have to accept it. Let's look at one final image by Blake. It's called The Great Red Dragon and the woman clothed with the sun. It illustrates a passage from the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible about the end times. In this passage of Revelation, it says that an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads descends upon a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. So the dragon obviously represents Satan, whereas it's debatable what the woman represents. Some say the woman is the Virgin Mary, some say she's the church itself, but whomever the woman represents, it is obvious that there's a great duality in this painting, the dragon versus the woman. Yet the dragon and the woman have a similar pose. Both of their arms are outstretched and they are mirroring each other. They're just flipped upside down. In this way we can see Blake's idea that good and evil are just parts of a whole, like the dark and the light sides of the moon. But the moon is still a whole. Good and evil aren't independent forces. They act together to balance out the universe. And with that, we're wrapping it up with William Blake and his association with Swedenborg. We can see in the beginning that although Swedenborg influenced many of his ideas and his illustrations, that he ultimately decided to part from the theological dogma of Swedenborg. It was too similar to the church's dogma. It was too similar to the government. It had too many rules and restrictions, and Blake was all about the human experience overall.